Okay, so antennas, bottom of aircraft, center line, 1030, 1090 megahertz. What are those units? Well, you're never going to be able to report through your transponder your pressure altitude unless you have one of these devices. You can have either a blind encoder, which is a device that you're going to have to feed static to, find a suitable mounting location for it. And the D-sub connector is going to need power, ground, and the rest of those pins are for the data that it formulates from the static input and then feeds over to the transponder for the transponder to relay to air traffic control upon request, the blind encoder, or an encoding altimeter, which is my preferred device because it would be as simple as taking out your original pressure altimeter. It's the same size, cutout, and attaching the static line to this new encoding altimeter and wiring up the D-sub connector, power, ground, and the pins that go to the transponder. Plus, besides not having to engineer an installation for it, like you would for the blind encoder, all altimetry devices are subject to a proper bench check and calibration at an increment not to exceed 24 months, 2 years. So if I go with the blind encoder route, I'm not only going to have to send out my blind encoder every 2 years, but I'm going to have to send out my regular altimeter, my pressure altimeter as well. So that would be 2 devices that need to be calibrated. Whereas if I opt out of the blind encoder and just replace my regular altimeter, my pressure altimeter with an encoding altimeter, I only have to send 1 device out every 2 years and save on calibration costs. So it's in the long run, even though you'll probably pay about $1,000 US dollars more for an encoding altimeter as opposed to the blind encoder, a couple of years it'll pay itself off in calibration costs. So that's the way to go. When it comes to those altitude devices, unlike the transponder's code switch identification in octal, the encoding altimeter or the blind encoder, the binary language it produces is the gray code. When we talked about the gray code, a code of least error, non-weighted code, ideal when you're counting up or counting down, and that's what altitude does, okay? You can't go from 0 feet all of a sudden to 10,000 feet without crossing every other increment. So this code is the code of least error because only one binary bit ever has to change its state as you increment in number or decrement in number, as you climb in number or come down in number. So that's why it's ideal. What we're looking at there is what would come from air traffic control on 1030 megahertz in the form of 3 pulses, pulse 1, pulse 2, and pulse 3. And how you're so that's an interrogation, a pulse train from air traffic control. How your transponder knows if that's a mode A, mode C, or even a mode S question is it looks at when it's coming in the door. It looks at the time lapse from the leading edge of the P1 pulse when it first comes in to the time it sees the leading edge of the P3 pulse. And if it's 8 microseconds, it's a request for mode A information, so code switch information. If it's 21 microseconds, it's a request for altitude reporting. Okay, and I don't really want to get into mode S details. It's a little bit more sophisticated for mode S, but it also looks at that. Okay, the second pulse, I think we'll get to it in another slide, but that second pulse isn't really to determine whether the question is a mode A or a mode C question or a mode S question. That second pulse, as compared to the first pulse, is to decide whether your transponder should reply or not to the interrogation. It's asking the question, is this interrogation really from the main energy lobe, the main energy beam coming from air traffic control, or is it a false side lobe beam of energy, in which case I shouldn't reply to it. Okay. When it comes to your reply, your transponder can send up to a maximum of 15 pulses back on a different frequency on 1090 megahertz to answer these questions, mode A, mode C, mode S. And your answer starts with a framing pulse, so F1, and ends with a framing pulse, F2, and the data pulses in between okay, which correspond to the code switches on your front face of your transponder. And also those bits also correspond to what the blind encoder and coding altimeter send out. Okay, those are your data bits for either mode A or mode C response. And I'm pretty sure right now, so there's, if I count F1 and all of the data pulses that are up all the way to F2, they're all up. So all of the A pulses, A1, A2, and A4, they're all up. B1, B2, B4, they're all up. C1, C2, C4 is all up, and so are all the Ds, D1, D2, D4 are all up. So really what your transponder is squawking or sending back right now is 7777. Okay, all your octal switches are showing sevens on the transponder. And not only are you squawking 7777, but a 15-bit called a special purpose identification pulse is also up, meaning you've pressed the ident button on your transponder, and for 20 seconds that pulse will remain high to let air traffic control know who you are on their particular screen. So this is what I was talking about for the P2 pulse. Okay. When it comes to aircraft, remember we can see out to 200 nautical miles, maybe a bit further with a transponder system from the secondary surveillance radar at ATC. It's not a problem when you're far out. Okay, aircraft will be interrogated by this sweeping beam of energy, the main lobe beam of energy, which contains P1s and P3s. Okay, your transponder looks at P1, looks at P3, and says, "Hey, did I just get hit with a mode A interrogation question, a request for my code switch setting, or did I get hit with a mode C interrogation request for altitude reporting, or is it a mode S interrogation?" So it's not a problem when you're way out, okay, a couple hundred miles out. It's when you get closer to the station, and this is a phenomenon of any transmitter, okay, is you get what's called spurious emissions. It's kind of like a garden hose. You have your main, when you squirt with your nozzle, you have your main beam of water, but if your garden hose isn't sealed very good around the gasket there, you get water spewing out. And this is a phenomenon of any transmitter. You get energy, replica of the main energy also coming out. Okay, you can't really do much about it. It just is. And it contains that replica information, or these side lobes. Really, we deem them as false energy beams. They also contain P1s and P3s. The problem is, if your transponder, was closer to the station and it got hit by a side lobe, a false side lobe beam, it would show up on the screen multiple times in multiple locations. And we can't have that happening. So what they do is from an omnidirectional antenna. So it's a different antenna than the one that's sweeping around on the primary surveillance radar. It's different than the secondary surveillance radar. They send out a second pulse in an omnidirectional fashion, okay, to engulf all of the side lobes. Okay, so your transponder looks at the amplitude of the P2 pulse as compared to the P1 pulse, and it says to itself, if the P2 pulse is less than the P1 pulse by minus 9 dB. So we're saying, this power here, P1 and P3s, it's super intense. That's going out 200 nautical miles. That's a lot of power. Even if you're inside closer to the air traffic control station, okay, that's still a huge amount of energy that you just got hit with, your transponder just got hit with. So it says to itself, if P1 is greater than P2, so the green represents P2 by 9 dB, that's definitely greater by 9 dB, is a lot of power there, then you should probably respond to that interrogation, because you are being hit by the main interrogation lobe, main beam of energy. However, it says, if your P1 is equal to P2, or if your P1 is less than P2, okay, you are being hit with a false side lobe beam of energy, and you should not reply to that, okay? So if P1 and P2 basically are the same amplitude, don't reply. Or if P2 is actually greater than P1, don't reply, because you're being hit by false energy. only reply when P1 is greater than P2 by 9 dB. Good. So what's this show? It shows, well, there's a third type of interrogation, third type of transponder. They became mandatory in the United States back in 1992. Canada took a while longer, but you're not going anywhere internationally with an aircraft unless you have a Mode S transponder. Okay, a little bit better of a transponder. One piece of information that a Mode S transponder gives air traffic control without actually talking to them on a radio, it does this just by interrogating your aircraft transponder, is your aircraft's identification in the form of its registration. Okay, so no longer will air traffic control have to hail your aircraft or you hail them and tell them you're in their zone. You know, it'll happen automatically, and your transponder will tell them as soon as you get into their airspace, you know, what your registration is automatically. The other part about a Mode S transponder that makes it, you know, appealing is that it also can talk to not only air traffic control, it's able to talk to other Mode S transponder equipped aircraft, and it's an integral part of the TCAS system, okay, the traffic alert and collision avoidance system. So a mandatory piece of equipment for a TCAS system is to have a Mode S transponder working with it. Okay, so it's well to see that on transport category aircraft, and for that matter, even commuter aircraft, you need a Mode S transponder because you're likely going to be flying international to other countries, and you know, you're going to need a TCAS system. It's mandatory, either TCAS 1 for commuter or TCAS 2 for transport category. So you'll need a Mode S transponder working with that system. So transport category aircraft, you know, carrying human lives, and even commuter carrying people need these kinds of systems, including, you know, flight data recorder, cockpit voice recorder, ground proximity warning system, and so on. So in this picture of, this is transponder, I'm looking at that, transponder. Remember, your aircraft, okay, is the replier. So your aircraft, first and foremost, gets interrogated. So this is, yeah. Wait a second. Just trying to see what this is. No, this is not, this is not transponder, is it? This is DME. How do I know this is DME and not transponder? Because in the game of DME, your aircraft is actually the interrogator, which is showing here. The aircraft is the interrogator, and the ground station, the DME ground station, is the reply. So this is a DME picture, and the DME system. Okay, when you first turn on your DME, your distance measuring equipment in the aircraft, it starts to formulate pulse pairs. The pairs are sent on a specific frequency to air traffic control, not air traffic control, to the DME ground station. The DME ground station takes it in, as well as everybody else's who's sending, and delays it by 50 microseconds. That 50 microsecond delay is on purpose because the DME ground station has to send it back to you on a different frequency and then relay it back into the sky. So it takes some time to take what's coming in from every aircraft and transmit it back on a new frequency. So the station embeds a 50 microsecond delay time into the game. Okay, so here we're seeing the pulse pairs. Every DME, when you turn it on and it starts to formulate pulse pairs, those pulse pairs are encrypted. Okay, not the pairs themselves, but the distance between the pairs. We call that jitter. Okay, so your pulse pairs are jittered. Everybody's pulses are jittered, so they're encrypted, and they go to the ground station on a specific frequency. They get changed to a new frequency and back up. But the only way you're going to be able to recognize your particular pulse pairs is if the jitter is unique to your aircraft. It's like DNA. Okay, so think of your jittered pulse train as being only yours and nobody else's. And every time you turn a DME off and turn it back on, it creates a brand new jittered pulse pair rate. That's only unique to your particular DME unit. Okay, so when it comes to distance measuring equipment, again, the range on the system is about 200 nautical miles out. It's usually channel paired with a VOR station, okay, because you're flying towards a VOR station anyway, so they co-locate DME stations with VOR stations. So North Bay Station is down here on the right. It would be a DME station, right next door to a VOR station. Considering we're probably trying to fly to North Bay, that's a good idea. Co-locate the stations. Where else can I pick up usable DME station information from? Well, top left, that's a DME station. So I could actually pick up usable DME information from a DME station. Can't pick it up from just a VOR station. So bottom left is a no-go for DME. Center, that's an ADF non-directional beacon. That's a no-go. But I can pick up usable DME signals from a VORTAC station. Okay. Remember, a VORTAC station is a civilian VOR station co-located with a military TACAN station. It's that military TACAN station that has DME capability, and including civilian DME capability. So, of the 5 symbols up on the screen, only 3 of them can I use to pick up usable DME. This one here, top left, top right, and bottom right. Looking at what I'm seeing here is those are 2, well, the top one is a DME display unit. Okay, so that's part of a remote mounted DME system. The bottom unit is actually a DME panel mounted unit. Let's address the bottom one first. So if that's a DME, self-contained unit, I can channel that DME 2 ways. Okay, so RMT means remotely channel. So you can slide this slide switch over to the position RMT, remotely channel, and these 2 windows will change. It won't be showing minutes anymore or knots anymore. It'll be replaced by a frequency. Okay, sorry. When I'm in remotely channeled, that's what you see. What you see on the screen right there. Okay, when you're remotely channeled, so try to picture the switch over in the remote channel position. When you're remotely channeled, you're actually being channeled remotely by another radio. Okay, look at the top unit here, the display unit. You're being channeled by a nav unit. Okay, so when you're in the remote position on the bottom unit, you're being channeled by a nav receiver. That, in all likelihood, the nav receiver is actually tuned into a VOR station. Okay, considering DME stations are co-located with VOR stations. And when it's channeled, it will take a little bit of time. Display initially is blank. Okay, it's in search mode. Everything is dashed up. But once it does finally lock on to the station, it receives its own pulse pairs back. Then information with the dashes will be replaced with, obviously DME stands for distance. So the first piece of information will be your distance away from the station. In this case, on the bottom unit, 58.8 nautical miles out from the station. Any good DME in this day and age will also provide 2 additional pieces of information. It'll provide your ground speed in knots, so 150 knots, and your time to station in minutes. Okay, so that, when I explained that was in remote channeling mode. If you go to slide the switch over to the middle to the abbreviation frequency, these 2 pieces of information kind of go away, and it's replaced with a frequency. You can now directly, instead of remotely, you can directly channel your DME using these knobs on the right-hand side. So you can put in either a VOR frequency directly in or a localizer frequency directly in and channel the DME unit directly. Once it's channeled, give it a few seconds and the distance to the station will come up. And that's sort of a prompt. Once the distance comes up, it's prompting you to slide the switch now over to the GS/T position to now introduce the last 2 pieces of information to that station, which is the ground speed in knots and the time to station in minutes. Okay, so when it comes to this bottom unit, okay, frequency and ground speed / time, these two go together as far as channeling the DME directly, or you can slide it all the way over to the remote channeling and it'll be remotely channeled via a nav receiver like the top unit is. The top unit right now, and the reason we're seeing what's up on the display is because NAV1 is channeling the DME system, and perhaps that's NAV1's tuned to North Bay on the VOR 115.40 megahertz, and we're seeing the distance to North Bay as 50.9 nautical miles. We're flying 100 knots ground speed, and it's going to take us 30 minutes to get there. If I move that NAV1 selector switch to hold, it will hold the channeling information from the NAV1 receiver, which is good. So it will continue to provide that information to North Bay. But what good is that? Well, now that I went from NAV1 to hold, I can actually now rechannel my NAV1 to, let's say, look at Sudbury while continuing to hold the information to North Bay. Okay, so it allows me to, that hold function allows me to free up a nav receiver to look at something else on the nav receiver. Now, if I move the selector switch to NAV2, that means the DME would now be channeled via NAV2. Maybe my NAV2 unit is channeled not to North Bay, but maybe it's channeled to Timmins. And then I would see the information to Timmins, okay, distance, ground speed, time to station to Timmins. And if I move it from NAV2 to hold, it will continue to hold the NAV2 channeling lines, the information to Timmins, freeing the NAV2 unit up to maybe look at Sault Ste. Marie or whatever. Okay, so that's sort of the advantage of that. You know, this type of a DME system allows you to channel the DME from two nav sources and hold the previous nav information. Good. When it comes to DME, when it starts to work and it's sending its pulses, its pulse pairs, the distance that you're getting is not really true ground distance, okay, but rather it's a slant range distance, and that spawns one inherent problem. If you're high up and very close to the DME ground station, the distance information, the slant distance information will be in error, and to some extent it might be considerable depending on how high you are and how close you are to the station. But in all likelihood, if you're that high and that close to the station, you're not really landing at the station. You're not landing there, you're flying over, so it's not a problem. By the time you actually want to land somewhere, you're going to be told to get out of the heavens, come down closer to the ground. When you come down closer to the ground, your slant range distance, okay, becomes more like your ground distance. They almost become one and the same, and the error is almost, it's minimal. Okay, it's not worth writing home about because you are landing. So you got to look at it that way. Let me go back a second here. When it comes to the DME sending its pulse pairs, remember, we got this system from the military. The military retained the the Y channels and gave us the X channels. So all civilian DME units in aircraft are using X channels, and hopefully you remember in class how to identify an X channel on your nav receiver. If you put in a VOR frequency like North Bay 115.40, right off the bat, I know 115.40 is a civilian X channel because the first place of decimal, okay, first of all, is 4, but it's the second place of decimal being a 0 that tells me it's an X channel. Okay, if the second place of decimal is a 0, it's an X channel. If it's a 5, it's a Y channel. It's a military channel. Okay, but we use only X channels in our civilian DME units. So when it comes to that, we don't ever channel in per se at DME frequency, because DME frequencies are up in the UHF band. They started around 962 megahertz and extend through to about 12, 13 megahertz. Okay, those are UHF frequencies. You don't ever channel in a DME UHF frequency. What you channel in is your regular nav frequency, whether it's VOR or a localizer, and it's channel paired to DME. Okay, so the DME is relying on a VOR or localizer channel to tune up the UHF frequency. And like I said, send from your aircraft in a jittered fashion, an encrypted fashion, your particular pulse spacing, pulse pairs. Okay, X channels, the distance between the two pulses is always set at 12 microseconds, whereas Y channels military, it's 36 microseconds, if I'm not badly mistaken. Okay, we went through that. And the reason I showed that picture is because I'm going to ask you, which of those antennas would be suitable for DME? Because those are not all DME antennas. Okay, so the answer to this question is, well, I'm pretty sure the DME uses the same antennas as the transponder did. Let's go back to the transponder. And the transponder was using those. So the spike and the blade are, interchangeable. They can be used for transponder or DME, these types of antennas, okay? Canador, on our aircraft in the hangar, they've sort of created a sort of rule of thumb. We'll use the spike for all transponder systems, okay, 1030, 1090 megahertz, and we'll use the blade for the DME radios, okay, in the aircraft. So when somebody looks under the aircraft, they say, oh, the spike, okay, that belongs to the transponder. Oh, the blade, that belongs to the DME. Just sort of what Canador did. It would have been better, though, to have bought for a transponder or a DME two of the blades, because they're more protected against erosion from the outside world. Okay, so the answer to this question here is, which of these antennas is suitable for DME, and for that matter for transponder? It's the spike and or the blade. These other two flat ones, oh, I believe those are for a system that looks and talks to satellites. I'm thinking it's GPS. Those are the two. Global positioning. Okay, here's a popular instrument we've talked a lot about over the course of the term, a little bit last term. A glorified nav indicator I keep referring to as a HSI, a horizontal situation indicator. But this HSI is a little fancier, okay? It's got a built-in DME display on the top, which is kind of nice considering, you're flying usually to a station, a VOR station or an ILS station. And wouldn't it be great if on the same instrument you're using to navigate with, that the distance to that station, your ground speed, and your time to that station also get displayed right on the same instrument? Sure, that's the way to go. Okay, so if I asked you, besides this HSI giving me DME information and DME readout, what else does it provide? Well, the answers are quite clear. I see 5 dots that way, 5 dots that way, and I see a needle. Okay, it might not be propped up straight, but anytime I see 5 dots, and a needle, that's a VOR indicator. Okay, or on approach, that's a localizer indicator. So this thing provides VOR localizer. And over here on the left side, this provides glide slope. Okay, so it's VOR localizer glide slope, and it's got a movable compass card. Okay, so it also provides, it's a slave compass system, provides compass information. So what can this particular indicator display? Okay, it can display VOR to get me to where I'm going. Okay, compass information, which is always good, so I know where I'm heading. And when I finally get to where I'm going, it's going to give me localizer information and glide slope information. So yeah, it is a nav indicator. And to boot, I got DME display on there. Any questions on that? And if I'm not badly mistaken, I see a little arrow here in green. That may actually be an ADF pointer. Can't see it 100%, but it may actually provide ADF as well. So what's this piece of equipment? Well, that's the piece of equipment. That's the ATC 600A that we used to do both transponder testing and DME testing. I'm looking at it right now, and I can see that it's in DME mode right here. And I'm looking at a velocity or a distance being displayed. So it's in the DME mode right now. Okay. Now, again, if you're looking at third-year avionics, they use that, but the newer equipment is these digital equipment, the CIFR 6000. It's pretty nice. It not only does transponder and DME, but it does TCAS, it tests TCAS as well, and Mode S transponder. Okay, so that's sort of where things are moving. The equipment's getting better. Speaking of TCAS, okay, there's our TCAS system now. Traffic alert and collision avoidance system. This is a pretty fancy one. I got two it looks like TCAS 2 displays, one for the pilot side, one for the co-pilot side, a Mode S transponder as part of the system, a top-mounted TCAS antenna and a bottom-mounted TCAS antenna, because I kind of want to see people above me and below me that are heading towards me. And if you remember, when it comes to TCAS, I said, well, kind of think of it as the game of Crash Bandicoot. Your particular aircraft has a CPA, a closest point of approach. It's got a little bubble around it. That bubble that's around your aircraft, whether we're looking at it in a profile view from the side or top down, that bubble is about 2 nautical miles, with you being in the center of that around you, and about 750 feet deep with you being in the center of that. The problem is there's any aircraft in your vicinity and they're getting close to your bubble, your closest point of approach, you want to know about that so you can take evasive action. Okay, so when it comes to TCAS, there's really 2 types of systems. There's the TCAS 1 system, which is required on commuter aircraft, which only really gives you TAs. You're saying, well, what's a TA? Is that a teaching assistant? No, a TA is traffic alerts. So it's going to let you know, a TCAS 1 system is going to let you know when there's somebody encroaching on your closest point of approach that's out about 35 to 45 seconds from impact to your bubble. Okay, not to you, but to your CPA, your bubble. So that's a traffic alert. Whereas a TCAS 2 system not only provides traffic alerts, when folks are somewhere between 35 seconds to 45 seconds to your bubble, but also if they get any closer, if they get it within 20 to 35 seconds of your bubble, then it'll spawn a resolution alert and a fix, a proposed fix, either in the vertical mode, so either a climb or a dive, or basically stay where you are command, to help you get out of a tricky situation. So right there, that's definitely a TCAS 2 display. The way the TCAS 2 does what it does is they decided to use basically a vertical speed indicator, rate of climb indicator to provide resolution advisories or alerts. So it's prompting you when this happens to, in color, to either climb or dive and to rectify the situation. So, I'm looking on this screen right here. This guy over here on the left is not a problem for me. So what I'm seeing here is an aircraft over on my left that is minus 12. So minus 12 means 1,200 feet below me. That is, basically even going lower. Okay, there's a down arrow, so that aircraft is descending. This aircraft over on the right, it's proximate traffic. That could be a problem, okay, in time, but that aircraft is still below me. It's looks like 600 feet below me and descending as well. It's this aircraft here that's sort of in front of me. So a little bit between 12 and 1 o'clock in front of me. And it's a scary color. It's red and it's a square. It's 300 feet below me right now. And it's descending, so it's going down. But what that has prompted on a TCAS 2, it's prompted this color bar to come up on this indicator that's basically saying, oh, you're going to have to climb. So right now you're climbing anyways, you're at 500 feet per minute climb rate. Climb a little faster. See if you can climb to get your indicator on the fringe here, the green or into the green, so we can safely clear this target. That's 300 feet below and descending. We want to fly over top of it and get out of the way. Okay, so that's the resolution that's been given to me because that aircraft was in 20 to 35 seconds from infringing on my closest point of approach. Good. What's this? Haven't seen one of these in a long time. Gee, they look pretty old now. These older GPS systems. Okay, so when GPS first came out, it wasn't as pretty as the ones we see now with all the color and the moving map display, and you know, they were pretty basic looking. They didn't really show any ground below you, just where you were heading. But when it comes to the GPS system, remember who owns it, and that might be a problem. It's owned by the American military. Okay, the Navstar GPS system owned by the American military. It's broken down into 3 segments. The control segment. So it says ground stations are basically monitoring the satellite performance, and they can make adjustments as necessary to maintain the accuracy of the satellite signal or not. Keep that in mind. Okay, the U.S. military can they have selective availability. They can shut you off. They can skew its accuracy at will. Okay, they won't do that unless they're told to do that. And the only way they'd probably be told to do that is if we were in time of war. So it includes the control segment, the space segment. So I think we mentioned there are 24 satellites as part of the Navstar GPS system, their particular system. The 24 satellites are in 6 orbital planes. So if we kind of count all those satellites, there's 24 of them. They're in 6 orbital planes with 4 satellites being in each of the 6 planes. 4 times 6 is 24 satellites. Okay, so that makes up the space segment. And each of the satellites has a name. They said each satellite sends out its own pseudo-random noise, PRN. And that's how any GPS receiver basically interprets which satellite it's picking up reception from, is because of the unique name each satellite has and sends out. And user segments, keep in mind, it's not just aircraft that have GPS. There's a lot of ground-based equipment that use GPS, farm equipment, people hiking. So a lot of people rely on this Navstar GPS system. And it says here, now, however, if you are flying, you're going to want to pick up a minimum of 4 satellites, because with a minimum of 4 satellites, it puts your GPS receiver in 3-dimensional perspective, 3-dimensional view. And so now it can pinpoint where you are in the atmosphere, okay, which is what we want for flying. If you can only pick up 3 satellites, you're deemed to be in 2-dimensional view. So you're lacking altitude. You're lacking perspective as to where you are in the atmosphere. I think I mentioned to some of my classes there, it'd be really smart if you when you buy a GPS, there's an option that you can interface the GPS to like a blind encoder. It's called an altitude digitizer. We used to do that all the time, just in case you couldn't pick up 4 satellites, which is rare, but just in case, the altitude digitizer would kind of rough in, sort of a fake 3-dimensional position, because it would put an altitude into the GPS system, even though you're only picking up 3 satellites plus the information from the altitude digitizer. So it's kind of a roughed in 3-dimensional perspective. So the newer GPS are so much nicer looking, okay? Not only do they have GPS in them, we're looking at GPS as well as COM, nav, and we'll see later. Also, we can put in some weather information in there as well, okay? Which antennas would be GPS? Well, this one's in the middle. Those nice little flat ones in the middle are GPS antennas. The other two, the one on the left, the one on the right, are either transponder or DME, your choice. Okay, we'll leave it at that, and we'll pick it up at next week when we're finishing this review. We'll pick it up at radar altimeter. So before you leave, don't forget, and I mean don't forget, there's only one last quiz up, and it's there for till tonight. It's the ground proximity warning system and autopilot quiz, and it ends tonight at 11:59. Be sure to get that quiz under your belt. I will be putting together a quiz. It might come out today, maybe tomorrow. That's a compilation of all the quizzes that we've had. Probably come out tomorrow. I'll let that other one finish up tonight. So that'll be the final exam study quiz, and it'll be basically a compilation of all the quizzes that you've done in the course. And as far as class this week, we're going to continue with the autopilot drawing assignment in your groups. So bring the resource material you're going to need to do the interconnects, obviously your ruler and some pretty colors. So for some groups, that's going to be submitted this week, and for I think sections, the Tuesday sections, which did we lose a Tuesday? Section 1 and probably section 5, I think. It's one of Jamie's sections. Probably have till the last week to do it. Okay, whatever sections we lost this week will be deferred till the next week. Okay, unless there's any questions, I'll see section 4 at 12:30. We're good.
Have a good one.
You too.